Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Philosophy 101 material. This is an introduction to philosophy of religion, a major and historical part of philosophy. The connection between philosophy and religion has been, despite some, I think, misconceptions and stereotypes, been a rather strong one. Sometimes I hear the stereotype that all philosophers are atheists. Historically, that's just not true. Philosophers have been interested in questions of God's existence and properties of God and the afterlife for as long as philosophy has been around. So we're going to start with the reasons to believe, the theoretical arguments that have played a crucial role in the history of philosophy and also play a crucial role in theology, the study of certain conceptions of God. So hopefully, as always, you're able to read the chapter first. There's, I think, a lot of great stuff in the second chapter of the Phil of Religion book. And we'll go through each of the major arguments, the theoretical arguments in this relatively brief lecture. Okay, so as I said, philosophy of religion has been a major part or subdiscipline within philosophy, going back to even before the times of the monotheistic traditions. And so by monotheistic, I mean Christianity, Judaism, Islam. If you go back and look at ancient Chinese philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy, they were also very concerned with what lies beyond, right? The metaphysical questions that we talked about before. So one way to separate philosophy of religion from other discussions of religion is that philosophers of religion are interested in the justification for belief in God, whether there are good reasons and what those reasons are. So it's not that in philosophy of religion, we're asking how you came to have a belief, right? Because that would be an exercise in anthropology of religion or sociology of religion or even psychology. But philosophers, as I'm sure you've come to appreciate by now, we're concerned with whether the belief is supported by good reasons, whether claims about God or a God's existence can be justified by good, compelling arguments. Okay. Obviously, a lot of people over human history have tried to define religion. As I'm sure you can imagine, that's a very difficult task. I think that I agree that it's rather difficult, but I do at the end of the day think that there are more helpful or better definitions than others. It's not that I think that there are any perfect definitions of what it means to be a religion, but I think we can start somewhere. And various sociologists and anthropologists have tried to frame things in terms of beliefs in the supernatural, or Emil Durkheim's famous discussion of religion has to involve the notion of the sacred. But invariably, these definitions can be too narrow or even too broad, respectively, because lots of human endeavors might dabble in the supernatural or even invoke the sacred. Also, we don't want to confuse philosophy of religion with theology, which I mentioned before. So certainly there's some overlap. Philosophers of religion ask some similar questions, but they begin from different assumptions. In philosophy of religion, we try to seek answers for questions using analytic deductive reasoning, the kind that we've been highlighting thus far in our class. And we assume nothing metaphysically in terms of we don't take anything as a given. Whereas in theology, you usually start from the Christian tradition or the tradition of Islam or Judaism or even other religions. So theology tends to answer questions using scriptural demonstrations specific to the relevant religious doctrine. So we're obviously not taking anything as given. So we're obviously interested in doing philosophy of religion for our purposes. Doesn't mean there isn't a lot of overlap. A lot of theologians and people who study theology certainly are interested in philosophy and philosophers. But theology typically relies on what is revealed, divine revelation, whether it's through a religious text. And we oftentimes frame this as natural theology. This is usually theology plus philosophy of religion. Okay, so philosophy of religion is concerned with questions including, but certainly not limited to, as I said, the nature and existence of God, the justification, if there is any, of religious belief, the examination of religious experience, the analysis of religious language and texts, which again can border on theology, and the relationship between science and religion. We should also be quick to point out that belief is not always binary, right? People often frame discussions of philosophy of religion or belief in God as either or, right? You either fully believe in God or you don't. But as I hope is clear, beliefs don't really occur as a binary, right? They often occur as a measure of confidence in the truth or falsity of a proposition, and so are best understood as occurring on a spectrum. Someone's individual belief may move across the spectrum throughout any given time and for many different reasons, right? So we've got, a lot of very confident atheists that think there's absolutely no way that a God could exist. And then you have those who think that belief in God is absolute, that there's no way that you couldn't believe in God. But, there's a lot of views in here, right? Which we'll mention. Okay, so I think this is a helpful place to kind of start speaking of a spectrum, because I think a lot of people maybe misconstrue some of these definitions. So if you identify as a theist, you believe in the existence of a God or gods, right? We need to, right from the start, point out that there have been many belief systems in the history of humanity, especially polytheistic religions, like in ancient Greece, the belief in multiple gods. We've had Norse gods. We have indigenous religions that believe in multiple higher powers. So theism is not just monotheism, the belief in one God. Theism can come in many different types, but typically refers to belief in a personal God, right? So that would be standard belief in the traditional Abrahamic religions. So a person who has this belief is called a theist. Further down the spectrum, we have what's called agnosticism. And this is not necessarily a belief, but rather the withholding of belief. So sometimes people frame agnostics as they just don't know. They're suspending belief, but maybe they're just not sure. That doesn't capture all agnostics, right? Sometimes it can be, we just can't have knowledge of God, and we never will be in a position to have knowledge of God. So that doesn't qualify as atheism, but rather skeptical agnosticism. And it could be because either they have not been sufficiently convinced yet, or because they think that such a thing is beyond our ability to know, which I just mentioned. So some form of religious skepticism. So a person who neither accepts nor rejects the existence of a God or gods is called an agnostic for our purposes. And then we have atheism, which is the belief in the non-existence of any God or gods. In other words, as the definition of the word or the root of the word implies, it's a denial of belief in a deity, personal or otherwise. So a person who has this belief is appropriately called an atheist. But there's also different kinds of theism, as I've alluded to, right? So monotheism is the belief in a single, unified, personal deity, one who listens to prayers and intervenes in worldly affairs. So again, typically we think of Christianity and Islam and Judaism as being monotheistic traditions, because in all three of those belief systems, to various degrees, of course, there are theological differences, but for the most part, they believe in a personal deity, a God who cares about and perhaps intervenes in the events in the world. But as I mentioned, there's lots of polytheistic belief systems that we get in different parts of the world, even in, as I said, indigenous Native American religions or belief systems. So polytheism is the belief in many personal deities. There's also deism, which if you studied the American Revolution or the founding fathers, many understandably think with good evidence that people like Thomas Jefferson was a deist. This is a belief in an impersonal deity who lets the world run on its own. Maybe it's the view that God created the universe, but is not currently involved in worldly affairs. So interestingly, if you know a little bit about Thomas Jefferson, he wrote his own Bible. He took out all of the miracles of Jesus. And there's, again, good evidence that many of the founding fathers were deists, not theists. So sometimes people, I think, mischaracterize the belief systems of the American founding fathers. But there are people today who think, yeah, there might have been a God to set things in motion, but the miracles part and the intervening in human affairs, that doesn't occur. So that would be deism. There's also pantheism. And this is the belief that the universe and the divine are one and the same, a unified whole. So oftentimes, even today, when you hear people talk about God is everywhere, that God is just the same as reality, that's more of a pantheist belief in God. We can also, very similarly, panentheism is a belief in a deity that is part of yet conceptually distinct from the universe. So hopefully you're just taking away the idea that beliefs come in different kinds, even within theism. All right, so as I mentioned, there have been numerous theistic religions that we could spend more time on if we were a world religion or comparative religion class. The oldest monotheistic religion is Zoroastrianism, which has a very interesting history. If you haven't heard of that, I encourage you to maybe do a little background search on Zoroastrianism. The parallels between Zoroastrianism, which started in roughly what we would call Mesopotamia, the Middle East, Persia, has a lot of parallels with later religions like Christianity, but I'll set those interesting historical points aside. Then we obviously have the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which include elements of both monotheism and deism, though again, it depends on who you ask, right? There's a lot of theological disagreement about the extent of certain tenets of those religions, right? Like the Holy Trinity might be viewed as polytheistic in Judaism and Islam, for example. We also have Sikhism, which is a pantheistic monotheism of sorts. Hinduism can often be described as a combination of monotheism and polytheism. So certainly can come across as pantheistic. Buddhism, which incorporates elements of both atheism and polytheism. And Confucianism and Taoism, which can combine elements of atheism and polytheism and come across as very pantheistic. So lots of different elements of theism and major world religions, as we can see here. Right, so I forgot I put this note in. Yeah, it's important to point out that these views have changed, right? Eastern religions and even New Age religions, we should point out, have evolved over time to hold many different views of the divine and are also more inclusive of what may appear to otherwise be contradictory beliefs. So especially in Buddhism. And by contradictory, I mean that they're able to subscribe to tenets that we in the West might view as contradictory, not that they're actually contradictory and don't make sense. That's not what I mean, but a different kind of non-binary belief system in certain propositions. Okay, I think, it's certainly interesting if you look at statistics from, the last few years. regardless of what your own religious beliefs are, the percentage of Americans who identify as theist has declined, especially when you look at my generation, which I guess technically I'm a millennial. The number of people who profess belief in God and or attend regular church services has declined. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we could say here about those reasons. Maybe you think that's a bad thing. Maybe you think it's a good thing. I'm not here to pass any judgment on that one way or the other. But I think it is empirically true that people who identify with a particular religion has decreased, while the number of people who claim to believe in some form of spiritual or spiritualism has in many ways increased depending on where you're conducting the polls. So I think there's some really interesting data that has come out from surveys about Americans and their belief in God. Certainly, though I think while this is still kind of old, I still think it's safe to say, if you look at most studies, Americans are more theistic than certainly many other Western European countries, right? So if you do some polls in Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, even France, Netherlands, Germany, things like that, the percentage of people, of American adults who believe in God, is much higher in the US than in certain other countries. Okay, so I think this is interesting. I never doubt the existence of God. The percent who agree, I mean, we're starting to see. Look at the age here, 18 to 29, which I'm guessing is many of you. I mean, so we see with the 65 and older, relatively stable, but like I said, I mean, the percentage of people who, I mean, I'm in this age range, certainly lower than the older populations, but it has been noticeably changing with new generations. So I think a lot of interesting data has come out recently. This is another recent one. If you want to pause it and take a look at it, that I would encourage that. Yeah, this is scientists, right? A poll from scientists from 21 elite American universities versus the general population. I mean, look at the certainty here. General population, about 60% have no doubts about God's existence, whereas, it's much lower for scientists. I don't know what that says, right? I mean, certainly a lot of people have opinions or preconceptions about philosophers being atheists and scientists being atheists. Certainly, I think it's safe to conclude or infer that, academic philosophers and scientists are more atheistic and agnostic than the general population. I think that's safe to say, but it's not safe to say that, everyone's an atheist or an agnostic in academia. That's certainly not true. So we want to be careful not to commit the hasty generalization fallacy. Obviously, a big part of philosophy of religion is figuring out the relationship between science and religion. Because still, a lot of scientists believe in some kind of metaphysical deity or higher power. What that is, I mean, tends to vary quite a bit, especially if you're talking about scientists worldwide from other cultures and other countries. Certainly most Americans do. So it really depends on who you ask. What is the relationship between science and religion? So here's the late, great Carl Sagan. He was kind of one of the first public personas of science. He wrote Contact, which is also made into a movie. He said, science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. So if we look at science, even Einstein, who is often identified as a deist or kind of agnostic, thinks that we can draw a lot of inspiration from science, even spiritual inspiration. Stephen Hawking, who just passed away a few years ago, took a slightly different view. He says, what I have done is to show that it is possible for the way the universe began to be determined by the laws of science. In that case, it would not be necessary to appeal to God to decide how the universe began. This doesn't prove that there is no God, only that God is not necessary, right? So obviously different opinions in the relationship between science and religion. So let's talk about the first major argument for God's existence, which is the teleological argument. The most famous instantiation of that comes from William Paley. Then we'll briefly talk about the cosmological argument and then finish up with the ontological argument before saying a few things about what we call reformed epistemology. Okay, so right, we'll look at three theoretical categories of argument and then two non-standard argument types, one for and one against God's existence. So as we said, there's plenty of different arguments for and against God's existence. All right, so if we're talking about the more popular theoretical arguments, typically we categorize them by the types of premises they use. So a posteriori arguments are the kinds of arguments we use that derive from observation and experience, okay? And that's going to be the cosmological argument. And by cosmos, we mean universe. And this is an argument from effect to cause and denial of an infinite regress. I'm sure you've heard of a version of the cosmological argument that since the universe began, something had to cause it, and that something is God. At its most basic level is the cosmological argument. These arguments try to show that from the fact that the universe exists, something must cause it, and God is that cause. So God exists. We also have the teleological argument, which is another a posteriori argument, and maybe you've heard of a form of this as well. Teleos means function, and this is usually an argument from analogy. And if you've heard of intelligent design, it usually is an argument that tries to make God's existence likely from the observed design of the universe. So typically you hear people make arguments like, if we look at the complexity of the human body, the human brain, the human eye, processes in nature, the complexity of the universe, somebody or something had to make it, right? There had to be a maker, just like we would look at a watch and say, this had to be made by someone or something. So the inference is that God is the cause of that design. And then we have a priori arguments, and these are arguments from reason alone. And this is the famous ontological argument. So ontos means meaning, and this is an argument from definition. It incorporates this notion that since we have ideas of perfection, and since we have an idea of necessity, that God's existence follows from that, that in order to talk about existence being perfect in some sense, there has to be something that embodies that existence, and that's God. So this would be an a priori argument for God's existence because we're using reason alone to argue for God's existence. And then we have non-standard arguments for God's existence. Sometimes we use inference to the best explanation. This is the argument strategy where we assume that if something is the best explanation for some phenomenon, then it must exist. And we use this kind of reasoning all the time, right? So if you go out to your car and it doesn't start, what's the best explanation? Well, you probably left your lights on, right? Or you left the door open, or you're out of gas, right? You can make an inference to the best explanation as the cause, right? Also, many people make arguments for God's existence from religious experience, right? Arguments that the best explanation for phenomena like things such as miracles or near-death experiences is that there must be a God, right? So that's a pretty common, if not the most common, non-standard argument for God's existence. And then we have arguments against God's existence. One that we'll mention is the argument from evil, sometimes referred to as the problem of evil. Right? This is the argument in a nutshell that tries to show that since there is unnecessary evil and a lot of it in the world that we have, whether it's children dying or a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering, that this is incompatible with the notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God. So therefore, God must not exist. This argument tries to show that God's existence is contradictory with the existence of, or incompatible with the existence of unnecessary evil. And then sometimes it can be inductive, which makes God's existence not completely ruled out, but unlikely given the amount of unnecessary evil in the world. Okay, so let's start with the teleological argument. As I said, we'll talk about the famous formulation by William Paley, and then famous objections from the Scottish philosopher David Hume. So William Paley was a well-known English theologian from the 18th century. He engaged directly with David Hume. Paley was very well known, greatly influenced other philosophers, theologians, and scientists, including Darwin. And his famous argument is called the design argument, for good reason. You can see more about this argument in some of the media I post. Okay, so here's the general pattern of Paley's argument, right? So he uses a watch. Now, I know most of us probably don't even use watches these days because of our cell phones, but the analogy can still hold, right? If we look at a watch, what do we infer here? There's a lot of moving parts. It's very complex. It looks put together. So if we found this watch on the beach, what kind of inference could we make? Well, here we go. There's got to be a watchmaker, right? What happens when we look at the universe, when we look at the complexity of planets and natural life on Earth? Single-celled organisms are very complex. So it usually is an argument that says there are certain facts about the world, specifically that it exhibits purpose and order. Premise 2, the ordering of the universe must come from an intelligent designer. Just like we say that the purpose of this watch must come from a watchmaker, therefore there must be an intelligent designer to account for the observed order. So just like we infer that the watch had a watchmaker, we can infer that the universe had a universe maker, and that universe maker or designer is God. All right, so what are some objections? Well, famously, a lot of people think that this argument is weak because the analogy is weak. One, the universe does not necessarily exhibit that much order or purpose. So many critics of the teleological argument argue that if we look out into the universe, a lot of things just happen randomly without purpose. That a lot of stars die, a lot of things occur in the universe with no particular reason or rhyme or order, right? So the analogy doesn't hold. Secondly, we do not know enough about our universe to compare it to anything like watches. We know watches are made by humans because we made them, right? So it's an improper analogy to take something like the universe as a whole and compare it to a watch. That analogy is just too weak. Not only that, it's not like we can compare the universe to other universes, right? We just don't have that kind of information at our disposal. We can certainly compare watches to other technology, but we can't compare the universe to other universes, at least not yet. Other critics will argue that the argument commits the fallacy of composition. It's not the case that whatever is true of the parts needs to be true of the whole. So the fallacy of composition is essentially the fallacy like all the parts of Anthony's bike are cheap, therefore Anthony's bike is cheap, right? That's committing the fallacy of composition. So what this charge is alleging is that since we can point to individual things, or even if we can point to individual things that have design, like watches and iPhones, it doesn't mean that the sum total of everything together must have a designer, right? So this is a common charge against the teleological argument that it commits the fallacy of composition. Even if we grant that the analogy works, many critics would say it would not lead us to a creator that resembles God, because the universe is not infinite and it's full of imperfections, right? So if we're supposed to infer a perfect God, given the fact that there's so many imperfections, some people take this a step further. They say things like, well, given that so many things don't work well, it doesn't really speak highly of the designer, right? When we make watches and they don't work, what do? We blame the watchmaker. So many people, some very famous philosophers say it's not even a good inference to draw that from observed design, we can infer a all-knowing, all-powerful creator, because they could have done a better job, right? We could have less suffering. The human body could be better adapted, things like that. Also, and this is a common rejoinder to the teleological argument, why would we infer just one designer? I mean, if the universe is really that complex, if anything, this would speak more to polytheism being true instead of monotheism, right? So it doesn't establish one God or monotheism. Even also, if the analogy works, many critics will argue those who accept the design argument prefer it over other explanations, like Big Bang theory, standard cosmological theory that we get in general and special relativity, for the wrong reasons, which have nothing to do with how good the argument is. So as we saw from Stephen Hawking, right, we don't need God, according to him, to explain how the universe began and how it works, right? There's no need to infer or hypothesize God's existence when our physical explanations work just fine without any such supernatural involvement. Okay, the next major argument is the cosmological argument, and its most famous instantiation is from Thomas Aquinas. So a couple of pieces of terminology are in order here. We need to talk about kinds of being, because this is really crucial for the cosmological argument. Aquinas mentions the word contingent in his argument, and what he means by contingent is a being that exists, but it is logically possible for it not to have existed. So what's an example of that? Me, Anthony, I'm contingent. Why? Because my parents could have chosen not to have me, right? They could have had no children, fewer children. I'm an only child from my parents. I have half brothers, but it's possible for me to have not existed, right? The thinking goes. I'm a contingent being, just like other things are contingent. It's possible for them not to exist, but they do exist. So they're not necessary, they're contingent. Denying its existence does not imply any kind of contradiction, right? We exist contingently. It's possible for us to have never been born, as sad as that sounds. We contrast contingent beings with necessary beings. And so a necessary being is one that exists necessarily, and it is logically impossible for it to have not existed. So under this interpretation, denying a necessary being's existence is a contradiction. Because many argue, Aquinas and other theologians argue, that God must exist necessarily, in that it's impossible for God to have not existed, right? God's existence is necessary. It's not possible for God not to have existed. Okay, so the general pattern of cosmological arguments, as this picture illustrates, is usually something like this. Premise one, everything in the observable world has a cause. Pretty intuitive premise for a lot of people, right? If you take anything that you're looking at right now, whether it's your computer, your phone, a book, right? Those all have causes, right? And you can go back to what caused those things. Premise two, nothing can be the cause of itself. Premise three, an infinite regress of causes is not possible. What does this mean? At some point, you have to say what the cause of something is. So if you take a simple example like my phone, which is right next to me, I say, well, what's the cause of this? Well, some people at Google made this phone and produced it. And then I go back, well, what made Google? Well, two people in the early or late 90s who got together, right? And so on and so on. But at some point that has to stop, right? It's an infinite regress of causes is not possible for Anthony's Pixel phone. Premise four, if nothing can cause itself and an infinite regress is not possible, then there must be a first cause. And the conclusion is, therefore, anything caused must have a first cause, which we call God. So that's the general pattern of cosmological arguments that typically assert that God is the first cause for the first event, which is the Big Bang. So this is a very common argument that we hear for God's existence. This is Thomas Aquinas, a very famous Middle Ages Italian theologian and philosopher. I should say Saint Thomas Aquinas, so 13th century. He was a prolific writer. His works have been very instrumental in Christian theology, both Catholic and Protestant theology. And he wrote this very well-known work, Summa Theologica, which was an unfinished manual for beginners in theology. So Aquinas took, I should give one more historical point here. Aquinas took a lot of what Aristotle said. So remember, Aristotle is in the 4th century BCE, and Christianity isn't a religion yet, right? His goal, like many other theologians around this time, was to take Plato and Aristotle and other Greek writers and make them simpatico with church teachings. So Aquinas is essentially resurrecting, in his cosmological argument, Aristotle's arguments for first causes, so that it can be more compatible with Christian teaching. A more recent version of the cosmological argument is called the Kalam cosmological argument from philosopher William Lane Craig. He actually gets this from Islamic philosophers. So it's actually an old argument that Craig has resurrected to use to argue for the Christian God. This argument is slightly different. It looks like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. So some kind of causal principle. And you can see this on the picture here. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. We know this from the Big Bang. Therefore, the universe has a cause, right? So pretty straightforward, but also very similar to the previous cosmological argument. But the appeal of Craig's argument for many is that he accepts the science of the Big Bang. He just thinks that since the universe began to exist and whatever begins to exist has a cause, that cause has to be God. Okay, so what are some possible objections to the cosmological argument? Against premise 1, well, the universe may not need an explanation, or explaining the individual parts may be sufficient. So a lot of people have pointed out, well, why can't the universe just exist? Why can't the universe be the thing that exists necessarily, right? Because one of the tricks that the philosophers who advance the cosmological argument rest on is that they've already told us that humans are contingent and God isn't, and then argue that all contingent things come from necessary things. But why can't the universe be the necessary thing, right? Then there wouldn't be any need to insert a cause that is outside of itself, right? And furthermore, objectors, philosophers have said, why can't we just explain the parts? That would be sufficient. So let me give you an example to motivate this objection. Let's say we're in a face-to-face class and I ask each and every one of you what you plan on doing for spring break, okay? And you all tell me, right? I go around the room and I say, what are you doing for spring break? And some of you say, I'm going to California. Some of you say I'm staying home. Some of you say that you're going to, overseas, someplace cool. And so on and so on. And I ask all 30 of you, roughly, okay? Then let's say I turn around to the class and I say, yeah, but where is the class going on vacation for spring break? Do you see the problem there? I can perfectly well explain where the class is going on vacation by appealing to all of you individual students. It doesn't make any sense to say, right, but where is the class going on vacation? That presumes that we're all going together in one big homogeneous group on vacation together for spring break, right? That sounds weird. So explaining where every single one of you individually is going on spring break suffices to explain what we're doing for spring break, right? So hopefully that example helps helps you understand the criticism to premise 1. For premise 2, a lot of people deny this causal principle or assumption for the need of a cause. Why must everything have a cause? I mean, if we just, sometimes there might be some things that just are brute facts, right? It's like asking, you know, why is, you know, some number a prime number? Well, it just is, right? So why do I need to explain that? Why can't some things just exist or be without a need for some elaborate explanation, right? So some people think that premise 2 is false because not everything needs a cause. Premise 3 is a bit, criticism of premise 3 is very well known. Maybe some of you have asked this. Why assume that an infinite regress is impossible? There are examples of infinite regresses. And furthermore, I mean, a lot of people are going to say, but what created God? Now, the proponents of the cosmological argument are going to say, well, you can't ask that question. I remember I did when I was a kid, because they just say, you can't do that. God just exists necessarily. But for many people, it doesn't seem like that's a sufficient response, right? Because we can ask, well, who created God, or what created God, or where did he come from, right? But of course, the proponent of the cosmological argument is going to say that's an illegitimate question. Furthermore, another criticism is, why assume God is a necessary being? Why then couldn't the universe itself be necessary, right? Because many religious views don't assume that God is necessary. Maybe if you take more of a Greek view, the gods were very human, right? They were angry. They had emotions. They weren't infallible. So why derive the conclusion that God is a necessary being? Why is an infinite being not problematic when an infinite regress is, right? So why not polytheism or deism? How does the cosmological argument establish monotheism any more so than polytheism or deism? Okay, so let me leave it there. I'm gonna finish up this lecture in a second video. I know that there's a lot going on here, but hopefully this video has clarified some of the major issues of both the cosmological and the teleological argument.